The woman's sobs echoed against the wrought iron gates like prayers to a deaf god. Thomas Blackwood stood at his study window, whiskey glass trembling in his weathered hand, watching the figure in tattered calico collapse against the stone pillars of his estate. Even from 3 stories up, even after 23 years, he knew that silhouette. The way her shoulders curved inward when she wept. The desperate clutch of her fingers against unforgiving metal. Margaret. The name tasted like copper pennies and broken promises. Thomas closed his eyes, and the years peeled away like old paint. He was 19 again, standing in the dusty street outside Morrison's general store, his father's debts crushing him like stones in his pockets. His boots had holes. His shirt, more patches than fabric. Margaret Sullivan had emerged from the store in her Sunday dress, blue as a robin's egg, her auburn hair catching sunlight like spun gold. "Thomas Blackwood," she'd said, her voice carrying that musical lilt that once made his heart race. "Still dreaming of striking it rich in them Colorado hills?" He'd shown her the crude map his dying father had pressed into his palm. Ancient parchment marked with X's and arrows, promising veins of silver that ran deeper than hell itself. She'd taken one look at his earnest face, his calloused hands holding that tattered paper like scripture, and thrown her head back in laughter. The sound had cut him worse than any blade. "Oh, Thomas," she'd gasped between peals of mirth. "You're gonna chase ghosts in them mountains while real men make real money right here." Her eyes had flickered toward the bank, where Harold Kensington emerged in his pressed suit, pocket watch gleaming. "Some folks got sense enough to marry security, not fairy tales." 6 months later, she'd walked down the aisle in white silk, her arm linked through Harold's. Thomas had watched from the back of the church, his saddlebags packed, his father's map burning a hole in his vest pocket. Now, 23 winters later, the Blackwood Silver Company owned half of Colorado. Thomas's mansion sprawled across 500 acres, its windows gleaming like captured stars. His name graced banks and railways from Denver to San Francisco. The boy who'd chased fairy tales had pulled mountains of silver from the earth with his bare hands and built an empire on the bones of doubt. And Margaret Kensington knelt outside his gates like a beggar, her wedding ring long since pawned, her husband's bank reduced to ashes by his gambling debts. Thomas pressed his forehead against the cool glass. Down below, Margaret raised her tear-streaked face toward his window, and their eyes met across the chasm of years and choices. She mouthed a single word. "Please!" The whiskey glass slipped from his fingers, shattering on the Persian rug like his heart had shattered that day outside Morrison's store. Thomas descended the marble staircase, each step echoing through the cavernous foyer like a funeral march. His butler, Stevens, waited by the mahogany doors, silver tray balanced on his white-gloved hands. "Sir?" Stevens murmured. "The woman at the gate. Shall I summon the constable?" Thomas paused, his hand resting on the brass doorknob. Through the stained glass, Margaret's silhouette wavered like a mirage. "No. Not yet." He stepped onto the wraparound porch, his boots clicking against polished wood. The evening air carried the scent of jasmine from his gardens, sweet as the perfume Margaret once wore to church socials. She stood now pressed against his gates, her fingers curled around the iron bars like a prisoner. "Thomas." His name on her lips sounded different now. Desperate. Broken. "Thomas, please. I know you're there." He walked slowly down the stone path, his shadow stretching long in the gaslight. Margaret's face emerged from the darkness, hollow cheeks, eyes red with weeping, the auburn hair now streaked with silver and hanging in unwashed tangles. "You look prosperous," she whispered, and there was no mockery in it now. Only wonder, and something that might have been pride. "You look hungry." The words came out harder than he'd intended. She flinched but didn't turn away. "Harold's dead. Took his own life when the creditors came. Left me with nothing but debts and shame." Her voice cracked. "I got nowhere else to go, Thomas. No one else to turn to." He studied her face, searching for traces of the girl who'd laughed at his dreams. Instead, he found something he recognized, the hollow-eyed desperation he'd carried in his own reflection during those first brutal winters in the mountains. When he'd eaten bark soup and slept in mine shafts, when he'd bled into frozen dirt for every ounce of silver. Why should I help you? The question hung between them like smoke. Margaret's fingers tightened on the iron bars. Because you're a good man. You always were. I was too blind to see it. Good men don't survive what I survived. Then help me because you're a bad man who remembers what mercy feels like. Behind him, Stevens cleared his throat. Sir, your dinner is served. The lamb you requested. Thomas didn't turn around. Margaret's eyes followed the butler's words, and he saw her swallow hard, her hand moving unconsciously to her concave stomach. The evening stretched between them, heavy with possibility and poison. Thomas could smell her desperation, could taste the weight of decision on his tongue like bitter medicine. He reached into his vest pocket and withdrew a silver dollar, one of the first pieces minted from his Colorado claim. Margaret's eyes locked onto the coin like a drowning woman spotting driftwood. The thundering of hoofbeats shattered the evening stillness. Thomas pocketed the silver dollar as 6 riders emerged from the darkness, their faces hidden beneath wide-brimmed hats, their hands resting easy on gun grips. The lead rider dismounted, spurs jangling against cobblestone like rattlesnake warnings. Well, well. The man's voice carried a Texas drawl thick as molasses. Thomas Blackwood himself, holding court with a beggar woman. Thomas recognized the voice before he saw the face. Jake Morrison, son of the store owner who'd witnessed Margaret's laughter all those years ago. Jake's clothes spoke of recent money, the kind that came from other men's misfortune. His coat was too fine, his boots too clean. His smile revealed gold teeth that gleamed in the gaslight like promises of violence. Jake. Thomas kept his voice level. Little late for social calls. Social? Jake's laugh was nothing like Margaret's had been, this one sharp and mean. This ain't social, old friend. This is business. He gestured toward Margaret, who'd pressed herself against the gate posts like a frightened animal. Heard tell Widow Kensington owes some dangerous people some dangerous money. Margaret went white as boned china. Jake, please. I told Carver I'd find the money. I just need time. Time's up, Maggie. Jake pulled a crumpled paper from his coat. See, your dear departed Harold, he didn't just gamble away the bank's money. He borrowed heavy from men who don't forgive debts. Men who collect in blood when silver runs out. Thomas felt the familiar weight of his Colt against his hip. State your business, Morrison. Jake's smile widened. $5,000. That's what the widow owes Carver and his boys. Now I could drag her back to town, let them sort out payment in their own creative way. His eyes crawled over Margaret like spiders. Or, seeing as you got more money than God himself, you could settle her account. Save her from a fate worse than death. The other riders shifted in their saddles, hands drifting closer to their weapons. Thomas counted the odds, 6 guns against 1, Margaret caught in the crossfire, his house staff unarmed and useless. And if I refuse? Jake shrugged. Then we take what's owed, one way or another. Maybe start with the lady's fingers. Work our way up. Margaret's sob cut through the night air like a blade. She reached through the gate bars toward Thomas, her fingers stopping inches from his hand. Please, she whispered. I know I got no right to ask. I know what I did to you. But please. Thomas stared at her outstretched hand. $5,000. Pocket change to a man of his wealth. But it wasn't about the money, and they all knew it. Jake stepped closer, his hand now resting openly on his gun, but... What's it gonna be, Thomas? You gonna save the woman who broke your heart? Or you gonna let us teach her the price of looking down on poor boys with big dreams? The silver dollar burned like a coal in Thomas's pocket. Margaret's eyes held his across the iron bars, and in them he saw not the laughing girl from his memory, but something else entirely. A choice that would define what kind of man his fortune had made him. Thomas pulled the silver dollar from his pocket, the metal warm from his body heat. Margaret's eyes followed the coin like it held her salvation, which perhaps it did. He turned it over in his fingers, feeling the weight of years and choices. This was the first silver I pulled from my claim, he said quietly. Spent 3 days digging through rocks so hard it broke my father's pickaxe. Cut my hands to ribbons getting this one piece free. Jake shifted impatiently. Touching story. But stories don't pay debts. Thomas ignored him, speaking only to Margaret. I carried this coin for 23 years. Through blizzards that froze men solid. Through cave-ins that buried my partners alive. Through nights so dark and cold I prayed for death. He held the coin up to catch the gaslight. You know what kept me digging? Margaret shook her head, tears streaming down her hollow cheeks. Your laughter. The words came out like a confession. Every time I wanted to quit, I remembered the sound you made when you saw my map. The way you looked at me like I was nothing. It burned in me like acid, but it also kept me warm when I had nothing else. He flipped the coin to Jake, who caught it reflexively. Take that to Carver. Tell him it's worth more than $5,000. Tell him it's worth a man's entire life. Jake examined the coin, frowning. This ain't worth 50 cents. Then you're looking at it wrong. Thomas stepped closer to the gate, his hand finding the latch. That coin bought me everything I own. My mansion. My mines. My reputation. Everything that makes men like Carver think twice before threatening me. The latch clicked open. Margaret stumbled backward as Thomas emerged from behind his fortress of iron and stone. He stood now in the street, unprotected, facing 6 armed men with nothing but his reputation and his resolve. Here's what's going to happen, Thomas said, his voice carrying the authority of a man who'd commanded thousands of miners through mountain winters. You're going to ride back to Carver. You're going to tell him Margaret Kensington's debt is paid in full. And you're going to make it clear that anyone who bothers her again answers to me. Jake laughed, but it sounded forced now. You threatening us, Blackwood? I'm explaining economics. Thomas smiled, and there was something in it that made Jake's hand pause on his gun. See, I didn't get rich by being nice. I got rich by being practical. And it would be very impractical for Carver to make an enemy of the Blackwood Silver Company over $5,000. The standoff stretched like taffy in the evening air. Margaret pressed herself against the gate, her breathing shallow with terror. The mounted men exchanged glances, calculating odds and consequences. Finally, Jake pocketed the silver dollar. This ain't over, Blackwood. Yes, Thomas said quietly. It is. The riders wheeled their horses and disappeared into the darkness, leaving only dust and the echo of hoofbeats. Thomas stood in the empty street, feeling something loosen in his chest, a knot he'd carried for 23 years. Margaret reached toward him again, her fingers trembling. This time, he didn't pull away. 3 months later, Thomas found Margaret in his kitchen garden, her hands black with soil, coaxing life from the earth with the same determination he'd once brought to dead rock. She'd filled out some. His cook, Mrs. Henderson, had seen to that, but the hollow look in her eyes remained, as if she were still afraid to believe in solid ground beneath her feet. She looked up as his shadow fell across the tomato plants, her face uncertainly hopeful. The morning light caught the silver threads in her hair, and he thought she looked more beautiful now than she ever had in youth, beauty earned through suffering, refined by loss. The carrots are coming in strong, she said, brushing dirt from her palms. Should have a good harvest by fall. He nodded, watching her work. She'd refused his offer of a room in the main house, choosing instead the small caretaker's cottage by the gate. She earned her keep tending his gardens, managing his household accounts, and slowly rebuilding something he thought Margaret Kensington had killed in him long ago. I've been thinking, she said, not meeting his eyes, about that day. Outside Morrison's store. Thomas waited. The morning was still, heavy with the promise of summer heat. I wasn't laughing at your dreams, she continued, her voice barely above a whisper. I was laughing at mine. At how stupid I was to think I could be happy with safe choices and small dreams. She finally looked at him, and he saw tears tracking through the dirt on her cheeks. I was 20 years old and scared of everything bigger than my daddy's front porch. You were brave enough to chase mountains, and I was too much a coward to chase you. Thomas felt something shift in his chest, like settling earth after a long winter. We were different people then. You were the same person. I was the one who changed. Married a man I didn't love for money that wasn't even real. She laughed, but it was nothing like the sound that had haunted him. This was softer, sadder, full of hard-won wisdom. Spent 23 years learning that security built on fear ain't security at all. A meadowlark called from the fence post, its song bright against the morning air. Thomas reached into his vest pocket and withdrew another silver dollar, not the first one he mined, but one of many that had followed. He held it out to her. What's this for? Your first week's wages. For the garden work. Margaret stared at the coin, then at his face. Thomas, I can't take your charity forever. It's not charity. He pressed the silver into her palm, his fingers lingering against hers. It's an investment. In something I should have invested in long ago. She closed her fingers around the coin, and for a moment they stood like that, two people who'd taken the long way around to finding each other, connected by silver and soil and the weight of years. The sun climbed higher, painting the garden in gold. Margaret returned to her plants, and Thomas walked back toward his mansion, but he no longer felt the need to count the distance between them. Some fortunes, he'd learned, couldn't be dug from the ground. They had to be grown, season by patient season, in the rich earth of forgiveness. Behind him, Margaret hummed while she worked, a sound sweeter than any laughter he'd ever heard.